Judge mocks homeless grandmother in court, but has no idea who's about to walk in. The Westfield County Courthouse loomed against the bleak winter sky, its red brick facade slick with freezing rain. Inside courtroom 5, cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows on the scuffed wooden benches and threadbare carpet. It was a somber space, one where countless lives had changed with the crack of a gavel. Eleanor Jenkins sat alone at the defendant's table, her 72-year-old frame seeming to shrink beneath the immense weight of the moment. Her hands, spotted, with the map of her years and swollen from a persistent arthritis that ached with the cold, clutched a plastic shopping bag. This bag, flimsy and crinkling with every nervous shift, contained every document she owned in the world: a birth certificate, her late husband's death certificate, Social Security papers, and a tattered photograph of a smiling young couple, standing before a small, proud house. She wore her Sunday best, a faded blue dress she had carefully hand-washed in the metallic basin of a shelter bathroom sink the night before. It sent a mixture of cheap soap and resilience. Over it, she wore a threadbare cardigan that had once been her late husband's, its wool still holding the ghost of his presence. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, a small act of defiance. Dignity, she had decided, was the one possession. She refused to surrender. 6 months ago, Eleanor's life had been contained within the 4 walls of the modest home she and her late husband Robert had purchased 43 years earlier. It was a home filled with the echoes of laughter, the smell of baking bread and the pencil marks on a doorframe tracking their granddaughter's growth. Then came Robert's prolonged illness, a cruel thief that stole not just his strength, but their future. The medical bills arrived like an invading army, devouring their savings with ruthless efficiency. The foreclosure notice was the final quiet. Surrender in a war she couldn't fight while simultaneously holding the hand of her dying spouse. After Robert's passing, the silence in the empty house had been unbearable. She'd lived briefly with her granddaughter, Jessica, until the cruel domino effect of modern economic fragility struck again. Jessica's husband lost his job, and their 2-bedroom apartment, already straining at the seams, couldn't accommodate an extra person without violating the lease. Now, Eleanor divided her nights between the cot-lined floor of a crowded women's shelter, and when the shelter was full, the cold, unyielding back seat of her 20-year-old Buick, the last significant possession she had managed to keep. Today's hearing concerned a trespassing charge, a formal, legalistic term for an act of quiet desperation. Eleanor had been found sleeping in the lobby of Parkview Towers, an upscale apartment building where, for 15 years, she had worked as a cleaner. On a particularly bitter night, when the wind howled with a vengeance and the shelter had posted its full sign, she had slipped inside, the muscle memory of her former life guiding her through the familiar doors. She sought only the warmth of the building's plush lobby, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing cold until morning. The security guard who found her had recognized her, his face a mixture of pity and professional obligation. But the building's new management company, a faceless corporation from out of state, insisted on pressing charges. It was a matter of policy, their attorney had put it, to discourage vagrants. Judge Raymond Hargrove entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of a man determined to clear his docket before lunch. At 58, he had cultivated a reputation throughout the district for his impatience with what he called nuisance cases. He held a particular disdain for defendants who appeared without legal representation, seeing them not as disadvantaged but as disorganized, an unwelcome disruption to his carefully scheduled day. Case number 47293, City of Westfield versus Eleanor Jenkins criminal trespassing, the bailiff announced, his voice monotone from repetition. Judge Hargrove glanced at the file, then at Eleanor, not bothering to hide his annoyance at the sight of the elderly woman standing alone. Another delay, he thought. Another sob story. "Ms. Jenkins, do you have an attorney today?" he asked, the question purely rhetorical. Eleanor stood shakily, her arthritic knees protesting the movement with a sharp complaint. "No, Your Honor, I couldn't afford one, but I'd like to explain what happened if I may." "The court has appointed public defenders for this very purpose, Ms. Jenkins," Hargrove said with a theatrical sigh, leaning back in his leather chair. "Do you wish to request one now? It will mean rescheduling this hearing." Eleanor hesitated. Another court date meant another day of figuring out bus fare, another day away from her tireless, often fruitless job search. It was another day of uncertainty she couldn't afford. "No, Your Honor. I'd prefer to resolve this today, if possible." The judge nodded curtly, a flicker of approval at her expediency. "Very well. How do you plead to the charge of criminal trespassing?" I suppose I'm guilty. In the technical sense, Your Honor," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I was in the building without permission. But I worked there for 15 years, Your Honor. I knew the night staff, and it was below freezing that night, and the shelter was—" "Ms. Jenkins," the judge interrupted, his tone sharp as a shard of glass. "This court is concerned with facts, not circumstances. You've admitted to the trespassing. The standard fine is $250 plus court costs. Or community service if you're unable to pay." Eleanor's face fell. The amount, trivial to the man on the bench, was a mountain to her. "Your Honor, I don't have $250. I'm currently between homes and looking for work. As for community service, I'd be happy to do it, but I'm also caring for my great-grandson. 3 days a week while my granddaughter works, it's how she can afford her rent." And then it came. Judge Hargrove's dismissive chuckle cut through the courtroom's silence, a sound that was both soft and shockingly cruel. It silenced Eleanor mid-sentence. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, leaning forward as if sharing a tiresome secret, "everyone who comes before this court has a story. Everyone has circumstances. But the law doesn't operate on sob stories about homelessness or babysitting duties." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the few spectators in the courtroom. The prosecutor, a young woman who had been idly checking her phone, looked up with a frown, a flicker of empathy crossing her features before being professionally suppressed. "I understand, Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice soft but infused. With a sudden, steely dignity, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm simply explaining my situation so you can understand why I was there that night and why I'm limited in how I can make amends." The judge leaned forward even further, his patience visibly thinning into a fragile thread. "Ms. Jenkins, let me be clear. This court sees dozens of homeless individuals each month. Many have mental health issues, addiction problems, or criminal histories that explain their situation. What's your excuse? You appear coherent and well-groomed. You have family in the area. Why exactly should this court believe you couldn't find a better solution than breaking into private property?" Eleanor stood straighter, her spine a rod of defiance against the judge's condescension. "I didn't break in, Your Honor. The door was unlocked for a food delivery. I didn't damage anything or disturb anyone. I simply sat in the lobby until morning, when I left to catch the bus to my part-time job at the diner. A job that apparently doesn't pay enough for you to secure housing," the judge remarked with a smirk. "Perhaps better life choices earlier. On might have—" The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a decisive thud that echoed in the tense silence, cutting off the judge's impending lecture. All heads turned as a striking woman in her early 60s entered the courtroom. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, and she carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She moved with the confident, unhurried grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Her dark hair, streaked with a distinguished silver at the temples, was swept into an elegant chignon. A single strand of pearls adorned her neck. Simple, yet unmistakably expensive. Judge Hargrove's smirk vanished, replaced by a wave of confusion and then dawning recognition. "Ms. Winters? This is unexpected," he said, his tone suddenly deferential, the sneering condescension replaced by a fawning respect. "The Westfield Housing Authority case isn't scheduled until this afternoon." Catherine Winters, CEO of Winters Development Group and one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the state, approached the bar. Her very presence seemed to transform the shabby courtroom, her authority undeniable even in this setting, where the judge supposedly reigned supreme. "I'm not here for that case, Judge Hargrove," she replied, her voice cultured but with a hint of steel beneath the polish. "I'm here regarding the matter of Eleanor Jenkins." Eleanor turned, confusion evident on her face as she looked at the elegant stranger who had spoken her name with such authority. Catherine Winters smiled warmly, a genuine and reassuring smile, at Eleanor before addressing the judge again. "Your Honor, I'd like to request permission to address the court regarding this case." Judge Hargrove, visibly flustered by the presence of a woman whose company had recently donated the funds for the county's new judicial center, nodded quickly. "Of course, Ms. Winters. The court would welcome your input." Catherine approached Eleanor first, speaking softly so only she could hear. "Mrs. Jenkins, I apologize for the intrusion, but when I heard about your case, I felt compelled to come." "May I speak on your behalf?" Bewildered, but with few other options, Eleanor nodded hesitantly. Catherine turned to face the judge, her expression now stern and focused. "Your Honor, I'm disturbed by what I've witnessed in this courtroom today. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins is not just any defendant. For 15 years, she was the head of housekeeping services at Parkview Towers, a building that my company, Winters Development Group, owned until last year when we sold it to Meridian Properties." The judge's expression froze. The color began to drain from his face as the implications of this connection clearly dawned on him. "During her tenure," Catherine continued, her voice resonating with conviction, "Mrs. Jenkins was known for her exceptional work ethic, her kindness to the residents, and her unimpeachable integrity. When my late husband suffered a massive stroke in our penthouse apartment 7 years ago, it was Mrs. Jenkins who found him. She didn't panic. She called emergency services, used her own key to let them in, and stayed with him until they arrived. The doctors told me her quick action saved his life and gave us 3 more precious years together." A new murmur ran through the courtroom, this one of astonishment. Eleanor stood silently, a single hot tear tracking a path down her weathered cheek. "Furthermore," Catherine added, her voice taking on a sharp edge, "Mrs. Jenkins isn't homeless due to poor life choices, as you so callously suggested. She and her husband, Robert, lost their home of 4 decades because Robert's cancer treatment exhausted their savings and their insurance coverage. Robert Jenkins, I should add, was a Vietnam veteran who served 2 tours and received a Purple Heart for injuries sustained at the Battle of Khe Sanh." Judge Hargrove's face was now a pale mask of shock. I was unaware of these details." "Clearly," Catherine replied, her tone making the single word sound like an indictment. "Perhaps if the court had shown the slightest interest in Mrs. Jenkins's circumstances, rather than dismissing them as a sob story, these facts would have emerged before judgments were made about her character." The young prosecutor, sensing the dramatic shift in the courtroom's dynamics, stood quickly. "Your Honor, in light of this new information, the city would like to request that the charges against Mrs. Jenkins be dismissed in the interest of justice." Judge Hargrove, clearly relieved at the potential escape route, nodded eagerly. "Motion granted. Case dismissed. Mrs. Jenkins, you are free to go." But Catherine Winters wasn't finished. She held up a hand. "Judge Hargrove, while I appreciate the dismissal, I believe there are broader issues here that need addressing." The judge's relief evaporated. Ms. Winters, the case has been resolved. I'm not sure what other issues— The issue, Your Honor, Catherine interrupted, her voice firm, is that Eleanor Jenkins is just one of hundreds of elderly citizens in this county who have been rendered homeless despite lifetimes of hard work and contribution to our community. The issue is a court system that processes human beings like paperwork without regard for context, history, or basic human compassion. Catherine opened her expensive briefcase and removed a slim folder. I have here documentation compiled by my foundation showing that in the past year alone, your court has processed over 200 cases involving homeless elderly defendants. The average fine imposed was $275, money that could have provided temporary shelter or food, but instead went to court coffers. The courtroom had grown utterly silent. All eyes were fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. Eleanor remained standing, her expression a mixture of confusion, shock, and a dawning, fragile hope. Judge Hargrove's face flushed with anger. Ms. Winters, while I respect your position in the community, this court operates according to the law, not emotional appeals or statistical manipulations. But does it? Catherine countered, her voice dangerously soft. Then perhaps you can explain why, according to these same public records, defendants represented by the public defender's office in your courtroom receive fines averaging 40% higher than those with private counsel? Or why elderly defendants receive harsher sentences than younger ones for identical minor offenses? My team has been analyzing court records for months, Judge Hargrove. The patterns are troubling. The judge's flush deepened to a dark crimson. This is highly inappropriate. If you have concerns about court procedures, there are proper channels. I've tried those channels, Your Honor, Catherine stated flatly. My foundation has submitted 3 formal requests for review to the Judicial Ethics Committee. All 3 have been dismissed without investigation, so I decided a more direct approach was needed. She gestured toward the back of the courtroom, where several people had quietly entered during the exchange. There was a woman with a press badge from the state's largest newspaper, a man in the sober uniform of the State Judicial Review Board, and another man whose suit and bearing screamed, "Senior government official." Allow me to introduce Melissa Chu from the Tribune, Commissioner James Wilson from the State Judicial Review Board, and State Attorney General Robert Diaz. They've all taken a particular interest in how our courts treat our most vulnerable citizens. Judge. Hargrove's composure crumbled entirely. This was no longer a dressing down. It was a public dissection. This is ambush journalism, a setup. I will not have my courtroom turned into a media circus or political theater. No, Your Honor, Catherine replied calmly. This is accountability, something Mrs. Jenkins and countless others like her have been denied. The judge, cornered and desperate, turned to the bailiff. Clear the courtroom. This hearing is adjourned. I believe that would be inadvisable, Judge Hargrove, said the man from the Judicial Review Board, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but carried immense authority. Closing a public proceeding under these circumstances could easily be interpreted as obstruction. Eleanor, who had been watching this stunning exchange with growing bewilderment, finally found her voice. Please, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. I don't want to cause trouble. I just wanted to explain my situation and accept whatever consequences were fair. All eyes turned to the elderly woman, whose simple, unwavering dignity stood in stark contrast to the power dynamics swirling around her. Catherine moved to stand beside Eleanor, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Jenkins, you haven't caused any trouble. You are simply the face of a problem that has been ignored for too long. Your situation, losing your home after a lifetime of work because of medical bills, being separated from family due to economic pressures, finding yourself criminalized for simply seeking shelter, this is happening to thousands of elderly Americans. It's not just unfair, It's unconscionable in a society with our resources. The Attorney General stepped forward. Judge Hargrove, I think we should continue this discussion in your chambers. Mrs. Jenkins has been through enough today. The judge, seeing no alternative that wouldn't irrevocably damage his career, nodded stiffly. Court is in recess for 1 hour. As the officials moved toward the judge's chambers, Catherine turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Jenkins, would you join us? Your perspective should be part of this conversation. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, gathering her precious plastic bag of documents. As they walked toward the chambers, she whispered to Catherine, Why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me. Catherine's expression softened into one of profound kindness. But I do know you, Mrs. Jenkins, not just from Park View. Towers. You probably don't remember, but 35 years ago you worked as a housekeeper at Westfield General Hospital. Eleanor looked confused. Yes, before I got the job at Park View. But how would you... I was a terrified 25-year-old, alone in the maternity ward after losing my first baby, Catherine said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. My husband was overseas on business. The nurses were busy, stretched thin. But you sat with me for hours. You held my hand and told me about losing your own first child, a little boy, and how you survived it. You brought me tea and an extra blanket, and you treated me with more compassion than anyone else in that entire hospital. Eleanor's eyes widened with dawning recognition, a memory surfacing from the deep well of the past. The heartbroken young woman in room 302. I remember you now. Catherine nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I never forgot your kindness. When I saw your name on the court docket this morning, I have a staff member who monitors cases involving elderly defendants. I knew I had to come. Not just because of what you did for me all those years ago, but because what's happening to you is happening to too many others. As they entered the judge's chambers, Eleanor straightened her shoulders. She was no longer just a defendant, but now an advocate, her voice about to contribute to a conversation that could change the very system that had so callously dismissed her. The meeting in Judge Hargrove's chambers lasted nearly 2 hours. When they emerged, the dynamics had visibly shifted. The judge appeared subdued, the Attorney General satisfied, and Catherine Winters determined. Eleanor walked with a new confidence, her plastic bag of documents now supplemented with business cards from various officials who had requested her input for upcoming initiatives. When court resumed, Judge Hargrove addressed the room with a markedly different tone. In light of today's proceedings and subsequent discussions, I am announcing several immediate changes to how this court will handle cases involving elderly defendants and housing insecurity issues. He outlined a new set of protocols. Mandatory, consideration of circumstances, automatic referrals to social services before imposing fines, and the creation of a specialized docket for housing-related cases with dedicated resources. Additionally, he continued, his voice carrying a hint of genuine contrition, I will be recommending to the county board that a portion of court fees be redirected to an emergency housing assistance fund for seniors. Finally, the judge concluded, I owe Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins a public apology. My dismissive treatment of her circumstances was inappropriate and failed to uphold the standard of justice this court should represent. Mrs. Jenkins, I sincerely apologize. Eleanor accepted the apology with a dignified nod, her expression reflecting neither triumph nor resentment, simply the quiet satisfaction of being seen as a person worthy of respect. An hour later, seated in a private dining room at the city's most exclusive restaurant, Eleanor stared in wonder at the breathtaking transformation of her circumstances. That morning, she had counted coins for bus fare. Now, she sat across from one of the wealthiest women in the state, discussing systemic solutions to elder homelessness over a meal that would have cost her a week's wages from her diner job. I've been thinking about your situation, Catherine said, stirring her tea, and I have a proposition for you. Eleanor listened, spellbound, as Catherine outlined her plan. Winter's Development Group was converting one of their downtown properties into affordable senior housing. They needed someone to serve as a resident coordinator, someone who understood the challenges, fears, and needs of elderly residents, particularly those who had experienced housing insecurity. The position comes with a beautiful two-bedroom apartment in the building, Catherine explained. And while I can't offer this solely to you without a proper hiring process, I believe your lived experience makes you uniquely qualified. Would you be interested in applying? Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. Ms. Winters. Catherine, your kindness is overwhelming, but I don't want charity. I've worked all my life, and This isn't charity, Eleanor, Catherine interrupted gently. This is an employment opportunity for which you are genuinely qualified. The fact that it comes with housing is simply part of the compensation package. Frankly, your perspective would be invaluable to this project. By the end of the meal, Eleanor had agreed to visit the property and discuss the position in more detail. In the weeks that followed, her life transformed with dizzying speed. The story went viral. Eleanor found herself a reluctant symbol of a national crisis. She accepted the position with Winter's Development Group, her interview a formality that turned into a 2-hour consultation session. 3 months after that fateful day in court, Eleanor stood beside Catherine at the groundbreaking ceremony for Parkview Commons, the new name for the affordable senior housing development. The symbolism wasn't lost on either woman. The building where Eleanor had once sought shelter would now become a haven. We're not just building apartments, Catherine told the assembled crowd. We're creating a community where our elders can live with dignity. Mrs. Jenkins will serve as our resident coordinator, bringing her lifetime of experience and compassion to this role. Eleanor stepped to the microphone, nervous but determined. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in my car, she began, her voice steady. Today, I stand before you not just as someone who found help, but as someone determined to help others. What happened to me is happening to thousands. But today, we're taking one step toward a different future. As she finished, an unexpected figure approached the podium, Judge Raymond Hargrove. I asked to speak today because I believe in accountability, he began, his voice humble. What happened in my courtroom was a failure of justice. Mrs. Jenkins, he said, turning to her directly, your dignity in the face of my disrespect has taught me more than any legal seminar ever could. Thank you for that lesson. 1 year later, Parkview Commons opened its doors. 58 seniors, all of whom had been at risk of homelessness, moved in. The building was more than apartments. It had a health clinic, a community garden, a child care center for residents' grandchildren, and job training facilities. Eleanor's apartment overlooked a courtyard where children played. Her walls displayed family photos alongside a framed news clipping of her and Catherine. The headline read, "Dignity is a right that doesn't expire with age." On the anniversary of the court hearing, Catherine visited for tea. They sat in Eleanor's sunny living room watching Eleanor's great-grandson, Tyler, play in the courtyard. Below. Did you ever imagine this outcome when you walked into that courtroom? Catherine asked. Eleanor shook her head, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across her face. Never. I was just trying to avoid a fine I couldn't pay. And I was just trying to repay a kindness from decades ago, Catherine replied. Yet here, we are part of something much larger than either of us intended. The ripple effects continued to spread. The state legislature passed the Jenkins Act, establishing new protections for elderly tenants. Other cities launched similar housing initiatives, and Judge Hargrove had become an unlikely but passionate advocate for court reform. You know, Eleanor said thoughtfully, when the judge laughed at me that day, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. invisible, like my decades of hard work and contribution meant nothing. She looked around her beautiful apartment, at the bustling community outside her window. Now I know that every life has value, every story matters, and sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways through unexpected people. Catherine reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it just takes one person willing to walk through the door at the right moment." Outside, the sun shone on the courtyard where a new community had taken root, a testament born from one judge's dismissive laugh, one wealthy woman's long-held memory of compassion, and one grandmother's quiet, unbreakable dignity in the face of injustice.